This session is supposed to last until we close, which may mean never. I don't know. But anyway, we've had different. I've had different feelings about this, and so what I'm doing is really sharing some additional thoughts about our institute and all. Everyone hear me?
Yes.
And there will be a chance for you to respond in various ways when all of this is over. Well, we've had a superb 5 days together so far, and I hope that most of you have both been provoked and stimulated and encouraged and discouraged, but most of all see a stream within yourselves that you want to continue the course that you have adopted, and that you want to continue the process of seeing to what extent many local places in our society can be changed, and that our society itself can be changed. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could see in the next decade a shift in the way in which we talk, so that the values of our historical documents could become the major language that we use and which we debate, especially the notion in the Constitution of we the people. But I hope it would be possible for Jews and Christians in the United States to be prepared to really examine public affairs and issues from the perspective of their own great visions of the future, rather than from their location in a kind of a dogmatic variety of belief systems that really are not critical to an understanding of our own scriptures. But I hope in these 5 days that we're also sensing a community that is beyond ourselves, and a connectedness in that community, and that we see ourselves more than ever before on our essential journey, which I count to be that having been given the gift of life, such as the universe does not know a period, that we have a sense that that gift of life immediately almost compels us to be on a journey to become as human as we can become, as alive as we can become, as joyful and loving as we can become. And your presence and the selection by the center itself and the staff has been very critical to what we've experienced in these 5 days thus far. And you do represent, in my mind, some of the best of the activist community of our city, of our nation rather, and some of the most committed people to that kind of activism. At least as I've listened, as I've read your bios, and as I've listened to you here, I am just very, very pleased with the breadth of experience, the breadth of the organizing that you're doing, the breadth of the issues that you have. And so I count myself as being very privileged to be among you, to be with you. It seems to me, someone has said that this is a historic occasion. I think that's true, and I hope we recognize that and we become more aware of it in the weeks and months and years ahead. I'm making a sort of some random thoughts as I've tried to listen and participate. And the first one is that I think that in contradiction to the anti-intellectualism and anti-student, anti-education forces in our society, the coming great movements across our nation must combine the strength of action that is creative and powerful, nonviolent, that pulls communities out, with our trying to continue to learn and be students of what it is we're doing and be practitioners of nonviolent struggle. And one of the things for which I'm very grateful for my kinship with the Center and for all that they have done is because we have no agency like this in our country that tries to gather the experiences, and gather researchers, to gather books and scholars and videos and tactics and games and making it available. I long agonized for that, and this center is doing it, and I'm so personally pleased with that. I hope that many of you become aware of the resources that are available. And I want to share with you some of my own experience at this point. Because as I've already said, in the 50s and 60s, these things were not available. When I started reading Gandhi's autobiography in 1947, in fact, in college, I discovered that there were some biographies of Gandhi available in English, and I also read those. But in joining the Fellowship of Reconciliation, I was impressed with the fact then that I had exposure to sources that gave me stories about effective action, especially in Europe during the war, which became a part of my own thinking and pondering, also became a part of how I thought about my own practice of nonviolence. I, for example, remember very clearly reading about the resistance of the teachers in Norway under occupied Germany. That was not widely spread in the United States at all, that I remember, but I did see pieces on it in various magazines. So I read that story. I knew the story. That was the Norway teachers. I knew the story and read the story of Denmark opposing Nazi occupation by literally being one of perhaps two countries that, from their culture, organized in such a fashion that they, in the midst of war, literally saved the Jewish citizens of their country. Denmark was the one I read about first. I read about the people who saved Jews and other exiles in France, and actually had the opportunity of meeting Andre and Magda Troikme, who toured the United States after World War II, late 40s, early 50s, and had a chance to shake their hands and talk to them personally. They were two of the major leaders in a section of France occupied, but who determined that for a great variety of reasons, and most importantly from the point of view of the neighbor and from the point of view of practicality, they were able to save some 5,000 mostly Jewish people and save them. I knew that story. I read that story. I had a personal sense of the importance of it by having met the Troikmes themselves. I realized some very good and important things. I realized through those stories from Europe in particular that there was an untapped potential here for struggle in the United States, an untapped potential, especially for black people, to break the back of the hostility and Jim Crow law and practice in my own nation. I also realized in doing that, as I was making decisions for myself about these matters, that I, in fact, probably could go to jail, could go to prison, and endure and survive and come out of it probably stronger than before I went in. I understood that and I recognized this. So I want to just lift up the fact that the scholarly accounts that I have found in A Force More Powerful and Waging Nonviolent War give a more comprehensive picture of those experiences that I first read of in the late 40s. Not only a more comprehensive picture, but more detailed. So in actual fact, in the last 13 years, I've learned more, especially for my teaching training purposes, from these resources, some of which we've had on our table, than from the simple accounts that I read during my college years. That makes me sense the extent to which we must have more accounts and more resources on these matters, and that we need to combine our business of learning from one another, learning from the campaigns, learning about our country, learning especially what nonviolence can be, what it has been for many, many different groups across the earth. And then we need to learn the very wonderful history of nonviolence in the United States across 400 years. And we need to increasingly then try to see if we can even do more to increase the knowledge and understanding of nonviolence in the immediate weeks and years ahead. So that's the first remark I want to make. I want to reiterate the very, very essential thing for us to all have a vocation of continuous learning and also being engaged in the actions that we need to be engaged in. That is part of my own discipline and effort still in the 2 or 3 fields that I try to work in. The second remark I want to make is that I propose that we see our work in scholarship and in struggle as producing overwhelming evidence and theses, and history that nonviolent civil resistance, nonviolent conflict, that in these things we have a social science of how activism can develop effective change. Now, of course, Gandhi said this, he called it a social science, a science of social change. And Martin King also wrote it in this book, the 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Scholarship and struggle should enable us to call Gandhi the father of nonviolence. And I propose that we learn to establish that and do that. You all will not remember at all, or know, or maybe know about the Time magazine project back at the turn of the century, just before the turn of the century, 2 or 3 years before the year 2000, 2001. They did a worldwide examination. How thorough it was, I have no idea. But what they wanted to do was to name the man of the century, or the person of the century. And the 2 finalists were Albert Einstein and Mohandas Gandhi, which in itself was quite unusual. Einstein, of course, is called the father of physics because in his doodling and pondering and wandering and thinking, moving out of high school and whatnot, never really going back to formal learning, he came up with the equation that opened physics up to an explosion of experimentation, to now today string physics and astrophysics and quantum theories, all the rest of it, to seeing the vastness and the immensity of the universe in which we live, and the variety of the ways in which creation can take place, and that force is used Now, physics was an ancient subject. It wasn't new. So Einstein did not invent physics. But he is called the father of physics because of what he did in his own lifetime to allow for the explosion of experimentation. Some of you know that. Well, I maintain that the same thing is true of Gandhi. He did not invent nonviolent theory and practice. The tactics, as we've learned here, go way, way back. But Gandhi, in two nations and with a great variety of issues, and what he calls his 50 years of experiment, he has given us an alarming literature that lays the foundation for us to insist in that he is the father of nonviolence, the science of nonviolent struggle, nonviolent conflict, of civil resistance. Now, I think that the Western world and the United States needs that for another reason. And that reason is that this allows us also in Western world to pick up an excellent mind and human being from the East and adopt those ideas and some of that language as we have done as a way of helping to infuse Western civilization with some of that which Western civilization needs if Western civilization is going to renew itself. If you look around the Western world, there are not many wise leaders. There, maybe our best are a few spiritual people, a few scholars, a few artists, a few scientists. But for the most part, when it comes to public affairs, we do not have very much wisdom, very much depth in humanity, very much awareness of the people of the earth or the people of their own country and the like. And that does mean decline and failure unless there can be an infusion of ideas and an infusion of people that will help Western civilization find a new breath of life and a new breath, perhaps, of freedom. But what's more significant is that we need a social science which demonstrates that the way of military science, and that's what it's called very often, the way of violence, has been something of a hoax in the human race because it has not been able to produce what it claims it can produce. It really has not done it. And at the same time, it has caused a wastage of human resources and a wastage of our earth resources so that even the earth is more fragile than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So we do have to intervene in a way, and it seems to be that one of those ways is through insisting in our work and activity that we're trying to discover new evidence and new theories and through new tactics and new understandings of how there is built into human history, in a sense, a law of gravity that pertains to spiritual, moral, social matters and human matters. And we may not know those laws or understand those laws as easily as the law of gravity. Please, no. This happens occasionally. And I have another remedy that I'll put in my mouth. No thanks. Thank you. That there are laws of history and human life and morality and struggle and politics that are not as easily discerned as the law of gravity or the law of force, but they're nevertheless handicapping the human family from discovering its own potential. And we see that very much so in the spread of pain across our own nation and across the earth. And so then the third thing I want to lift up is that, that I agree and disagree with the people who see conversion and the change of life as a critical component. On the other side of the coin, I know at the same moment the conversion does occur through nonviolent presence. But I think conversion is more complex than what we know. And let me just give you a couple of illustrations of this. I know the campaigns in nonviolence will instantly affect some people and awaken them and change the way they behave. But it doesn't change everyone, and it does not change a lot of the folk who have an ideological commitment to an emotional commitment to the status quo. In Scarrett College, I'm on my home ground because I moved to Nashville in 1958. As some of you may know, I was expelled from Vanderbilt when I enrolled in Vanderbilt in the fall of '58. In 1960. In 1996 or 5 or 6, the chancellor retired, apologized to me as he apologized to other people around Nashville about the incident itself. And we had lunch, my wife and I had lunch with him, and he apologized and talked to us about it for a couple of hours. We held no animosity towards the chancellor, period, in all of this period, nor to Vanderbilt. Neither Dorothy or I. In 2006, Vanderbilt invited me back to become the alumnus of the year of the university, the black alumnus next year, and then to take me on as a distinguished visiting professor with an anonymously endowed chair in my name that can pass from department to department. It's not a history chair or a sociology chair or a theology chair. It's a university chair, so it can move around the university. But from March to June of 1960, the chancellor would hear no compromise, no renegotiation of my expulsion. My expulsion was done by the fact that on the executive committee I had two of our opponents, our fiercest opponents from the downtown area. And they're the ones who panicked the expulsion. The Divinity School faculty negotiated for 3 months to try to change it. And the chancellor would not hear of it, period. It was a settled matter. But then after, in late May or early June, when the chancellor said again no to a compromise plan, 10 members of the faculty of the Divinity School submitted their resignations. And it had become one of the finest theological schools, interfaith, theologies of very different ways, and in the nation, which is why I selected to come to Nashville. So when the 10 resigned, then walks into the office a highly regarded physicist in the country who'd been brought to Vanderbilt as a very, very young man by the chancellor to help build the science departments. The university is no longer a Southern University school for culture. It's become the 17th finest university in the nation in recent decades. That physicist walks into the office of the chancellor who recruited him to come here. And he tells the chairman of the board of trustees and the chancellor that a compromise has to come. The decision must be changed. And why? Because he was the voice for almost the entirety of the faculty of the university who had written their letters of resignation, but withholding them until this physicist could try to negotiate on their behalf the compromise. So the compromise was done within about 24 hours. All of the law school faculty had written letters of resignation. All of the medical school, the divinity school essentially had already started the process. All the physical sciences, the social sciences, schools of education and whatnot. Only a handful of faculty people had not done it. Now, Jim Lawson was not the issue. What a university is about was the issue. So the faculty exerted maximum power, and within about 24 hours, a compromise was reached, which was acceptable to then the divinity school faculty, and with which I agreed. I didn't like the entire thing, but I recognized that it was the best that could be done under the circumstances, and that show of power is what did it. So I have no concept of absolute conversion at this point, or the power of conversion. I do insist that even in the converting process, the show of power is critical. And I speak as a United Methodist pastor of 43 years of fairly large congregations since 1962 and 1999. And I'm one who believes that in the process of people having transforming experiences. But I know that the invisible power of life itself is a major part of that transformation. And so as a consequence, then the faculty went on to create requirements for the university so that no student in good standing could again be expelled by the trustees, period, and no student could be expelled without a due process and without some kind of hearing. Because all of that stuff, I sent word to the chancellor that I would be glad to visit with the executive committee of the trustees, but none of that was ever thought about. So the power changed the behavior, changed the decision. And our two major enemies downtown, to the best of my knowledge, have never changed an iota in their thought of the morality and rightness of segregation and Jim Crow law. This is one of the places where I myself discovered the great difference between what I think to be pacifism and Gandhi's analysis of nonviolent struggle. Because the pacifist community, when I was in college, was arguing over the use of power, and many said, well, there's no power in persuasion. That's simply not true for me. It wasn't true for me because my own bringing up with a family in which both parents were immigrants to the United States, technically, but not completely. Nevertheless, it was a family of love and truth and the rest of it. And I felt from, if I could have known my first day of life, I felt from all I could know that love was a persuasive power in my life that set me on the right course from the beginning, which led to my waking up to the notions of nonviolence and the rest of it. So I knew that love itself has power. So persuasion is a form of power. So power is a neutral force, and nonviolence must create new power and new reflections of power in order to make itself effective and in order to see conversion process triggered. The second example I would give you is my ministry in Memphis, Tennessee. One morning I woke up after I'd been there a little while, and the commercial appeal on the front page, I think of its second section, had a report of a speech by a major power broker of the city. Major wealthy person, business person, lawyer, public figure, one of the decision makers. And I was called the most irresponsible person in the city, an irresponsible Negro. And he said, and that art indicated that he said that I should be discredited by the black community and I should be run out of town. Now that wasn't an unexpected threat in some ways, because Memphis, Tennessee had a Democratic Party and a crump machine that for years had chased some of the finest minds, black and white, though mostly black, out of the city for decades. No one who promised the possibility of being a leader, a pastor, or a dentist, or anyone like that was going to be allowed to remain in the city. And that history was fairly well known. So he's making a serious threat. I had organized against the wishes of the city and county government. I had organized in matters of poverty and hunger and justice. Was able, in spite of the naysaying of the two governments, establish the first Head Start group in the city, and then also organize what we call a Map South Association that received federal funds around the commission of the two governments so that we could organize the city in ways for social change, especially to fight poverty. I acted because the Chamber of Commerce and local governments said there's no poverty in Memphis. And the nation said that Memphis had the second largest urban poverty pocket, what it was called back then, in the United States. In our early organizing efforts, we found babies of 6 months old, 10 months old, who had all the symptoms and physical characteristics of malnutrition. So we realized that there was a desperate struggle just for food going on in various parts of our city. Well, we worked on this anyway. But after some months of working directly with him and others to get the two governments to establish an anti-poverty program and to face up to the reality, months later, the same newspaper reported that the same man said that I was the most responsible urban leader in the city of Memphis. Actually, I had always thought he was a good man from the day I first met him. I really had. Actually, I'd always thought he was an elder of the Presbyterian Church. And so that that also made me think, well, he must have something going on for him of a very sizable and church that had an upbeat perspective, congregation had an upbeat perspective. But he changed in the process. And we are friends to this day. I did the eulogy maybe 2 or 3 years ago for his essentially adopted son. And in between, in the last decade or so when I've gone into Memphis, he has met me once or twice at the airport to escort me around the city. So that is a conversion-changing process. But again, it's more complicated, and I suspect that you have to have the power to help people change their behavior as well as their minds in order to ignite this wonderful consequence of nonviolence that is called conversion or personal transformation. And so I want to speak for just a moment about this business of the power of nonviolence, and at least what I have come in part to understand by it. In my first philosophy class, I read the books of Aristotle in my sophomore year, and I came across this definition of power by Aristotle, that power is the capacity to effect purpose. And I've wrestled with that because I think Aristotle is saying that power is a given, and we've had a splendid demonstration of that power in 9 months old Aurelie wandering around our institute, because that's where it begins. He has no serious consciousness of the power in his bones, but he's done all the right things to demonstrate that power is there, and that it is on the inside, and it's a gift of life itself, and that he's following it steadily every day as we've watched him. We can see that power. I think that's the power of creation, which is nonviolent power. It's the power of life itself. It's the power of love. I want to use that term deliberately because a paleontologist and theologian in the 20th century by the name of Teilhard de Chardin, in some of his writings, began to announce that from his studies in science and theology, love was the psychical energy of creation. That it didn't come from nothing, it did come from nothing rather, but it comes out of invisible world, an invisible source of energy. And I like that in particular because somewhere Jesus of Nazareth says that God is spirit. That's all. God is spirit. The power of creation is an invisible force in the midst of our earth, in the midst of our human race. And so I maintain that the first front of nonviolent power is in us human beings. Each of us is a part of is the athlete on the front line, wherever we live. And let me quickly just add a couple of things to that. John Lewis, in his book, Walking with the Wind, describes how he says that these workshops that we did in Nashville in 59 and 60 literally changed his life. And he says boldly in the opening pages of that book, Jim Lawson changed my life. Well, I know I don't change anybody's life, so I don't have any illusions about that. But I do also know that you can live in certain ways and you can work in certain ways that people that you may not even know begin to spark within themselves of doing the work that they need to do to heal and to be lifted and to be transformed. I think that's the power of nonviolence. So John Lewis is one illustration of that. The advantage we had in the 50s and 60s is that black people were not apathetic, nor were students apathetic, because the generation of students in the 50s were called apathetic, indifferent. But it wasn't apathy at all. It was rather, in some ways, perhaps, that they had been numbed by the way in which our society tries to make each of us feel powerless in the midst of our own plights and as we watch and see the plights of other people. And what nonviolence does is tries to create a paradigm in organizing that allows some people to discover that, yes, I'm not powerless, and I can begin to try to understand the power that is within me, and I can join with others to help make a difference. Well, I think that power involves from us an implacable critique of violence. I don't think anyone should be absolutist about violence. And I can go through some other experiences of mine, but I will not. Violence represents the misuse and the wasting of power, the misdirection of power. And some years ago, the Surgeon General, who was Everett Koop, 1984 in fact, said something like this: violence is every bit of a public health issue for me and my successors in this century as smallpox, tuberculosis, syphilis were for my profession in the last 2 centuries. This is 1984. He was Reagan, Surgeon General of the United States. But he pushed the violence as a public health issue. He pushed violence as a public health issue. And so then later on, the CDC, and I don't remember the year when this was said, written, but said that violence is the threat or the actual use of power against an individual, a group, or community that either results in or has high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, or deprivation. So I've changed that to some extent, so that I think, for me, violence is the misuse of power. Violence is the intimidation, the harassment, or the injury, or the killing of a person, or persons, or a community, or village, for the purpose to thus dominate their situation, and at the same time, it deprives those people of their creation-given right to access the life and to access the life. So there's a double whammy. It devastates and injures and kills, and also deprives people of their fundamental chance for life. Now, within that context, I see structural violence, I see verbal violence as critical elements of what violence is about. I think that why Felipe here has this list of 4 things that people all admitted to. One of them is no abusive language, no mistreating other people. I think that's absolutely essential. I come to think that when Jesus of Nazareth, and when I say Jesus of Nazareth, I hope you will do the intellectual exercise of wiping out all the dogmas that you've learned across the centuries, and the dogmas of the church. That's, I think, an important exercise for all kinds of people. Recognize Jesus as one of the extraordinary people who's ever lived. There are not many of them, but you may want to do an exercise sometime of who you think are the rather remarkable folk who've lived. I would put in that list Eleanor Roosevelt as an example as well. But list those people. Jesus was that sort of human being. And we know him for many different reasons, but we know more about him today than the folk who wrote the scriptures knew about him in their day. I think that's actually true. That's my experience. Jesus is one of the fields I read in. I've read in it for 30 or 40 years. I've tried to stay in touch with the scholarship. And I've read most of the books even from way back as in the initial exploding of scholarship in the 19th century on Jesus. So I do not say this very lightly, but I say it very, very deliberately. Jesus says a couple of things that are rather critical in my mind that we need in nonviolent understanding. One, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. That's very contradictory to the doctrines and dogmas of sin. And he's speaking to multitudes of people who have come from all around the region, from Tyre and Judea and from Caesarea Philippi, from beyond the Jordan, from Galilee, from Samaria. That's what the texts there say just before he said that. They came from all the surrounding regions. Whether they were 5,000 or 12,000, we don't know. It's not said there as it's said in some other places. But it's clear he is speaking to people of the land, the people of the small villages, and he says to them, not you are a sinner, but you are the salt of the earth. And then, Matthew 5:16, he says, you are the light of the world. I've rarely heard a sermon on that from anyone. It is that sort of definition of you, of me, of all human beings that we can take out of the scriptures and use it within the context of the nonviolent element of the personal power that is from creation, that is from life, and that we must somehow help find the various ways by which we can speed up the process by which people are willing to face their sense of not having power and replace it by the realization that within themselves there is power which they must exercise and use. And with that in mind, then the last thing I want to say is that in the 21st century, campaigns for nonviolence in the United States are more difficult and more perplexing than what we think. While a lot of the work that has been done on scenes of authoritarianism, we have to remember that almost from the beginning, we in the United States have had our own American-made tyranny. In the 17th century, when we had the hunts for witches, and we burned and killed and hung people, that was a part of the beginning of the early tyranny. When we hung Mary Dyer in the 17th century in Boston because of her religious conscience, she kept coming back. That's religious. That is tyranny. And this became a part of the way in which we operated as a 13 colonies. Before that, we had the notion that the Indian was the other. And that's the beginning of how we started our development of the notion that some human beings are inferior and unequal. And we've gone through in our country, the 19th century and early 20th century, where we have tried to scientifically show that the brain of the Negro or the Chinese person in California is smaller than the brain of the Caucasian. While those points of view are now pretty largely dismissed, we still have people who are of that mind, like the way in which some people believe that the earth is still flat. So I want to insist that a part of our struggle is against that history of ours, the 250 years of slavery, as we perfected the beginning parts of our racism that started under the Indians, with the Indians, and all. And then another 130 years of Jim Crow law and dark codes. So that our present situation is riddled with the reality of so many people who are attached to the racism, to the sexism, to the violence, and to the plantation capitalism and its theories and practices. And these are interconnected and interrelated. They require nonviolent people to decide that they're going to have to tackle them in the midst of campaigning, whether we like it or not. This RSVPC that I propose is a complex social, psychological system. It is ideological. It is not based on any database. It is not based on any science. It is not based upon any kind of open readiness to discuss it. It is pretty much a system that is rooted in a closed system where all the answers are, but none of the questions. So it's ideological. Secondly, it is convinced that all the people in this RSVPC are inferior people. They are less human than the rest of us. They are unequal. They are people who only can be controlled by domination and violence. And thus, the economic system and the political system and the criminal justice system is still very much intact with its tyranny. And I like to say sometimes that tyranny has grown extremely large and extremely perplexing. It's George Mason who in the Constitutional Convention said that every plantation owner is a petty tyrant. Well, the petty tyrant has come home to roost in many different ways across our land, and many people have bought into it. And the third element about this is that over the years we've established repressive systems that give stability. And so that there's been almost no transition between the dismantling of the legal segregation system and the increase and escalation of the prison system that many people recognize has been a cradle to prison pipeline for people of color. And with a criminal justice system and a court system and a political legislative system that have undergirded the prison system. It's not just the new Jim Crow, it is actually, in fact, the old racism, the old sexism, the old violence, including plantation capitalism. In Florida, I understand private prison systems that have put a tag on youngsters in Florida who they think in the elementary school will emerge into the juvenile court and into the criminal court.
Amen.
I think that, in fact, you and I have to decide if we're going to have 21st century campaigns for truth and justice, for the building of community, for pulling the powers of people together so that they can effect change. We are going to have to face up to, and in this whole effort, we will have to face up to the reality of an emotional, invisible hold that racism, sexism, violence, and plantation capitalism has upon a great number of our fellow Americans who don't even know that it has a hold on them. How do we deal with that issue? But it's Martin King who has said that only a refusal to hate or kill can put an end to the chain of violence in the world and lead us to a community where human beings can live together without fear. Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives. So what I'm boldly saying that my experience of nonviolence has meant not only, as Jack said this morning, being a human being striving to achieve as much of the capacity of being a human being and becoming a human being one and becoming even more so. It not only involves that, but it involves on the other side the lifting of campaigns that can better convince other citizens in a fashion that will make the future a bright future for economic, political, social, racial, cultural, gender, justice, and community at every level. And I'm convinced that that's my hope. I'm convinced is the hope of the nation, for the nation as a whole. So we represent some of the people who can be the athletes for truth and power that can transform ourselves more and transform the world in which we live. And I would just put it to you very clearly that it's very, very urgent that nonviolent struggle, wherever we are, becomes the central way in which we work personally and socially. So those are my remarks on this evening.